By the spring of 1945, the defeat of Germany was obvious. The Germans could no longer control the Atlantic, so the shipping became possible once again. And so in the spring, Friedrich Hayek was able to come to the United States for a speaking engagement. There had been some notoriety, some attention by this time for the road to serfdom. And he was a well-known economist. He had been the opponent of Keynes in the 1930s, so he was respected. And in that period, the Reader's Digest summarized the road to serfdom at the end of the issue. They would have a book summary, condensed book, one per issue. And for some amazing reason, the editor decided to have the road to serfdom summarized. I once heard Hayek give a speech about what took place. He said he got on the boat as an obscure professor teaching in Great Britain, and when he got off the boat, he was a celebrity. Reporters had come to meet him at the boat. They wanted to hear what he had to say. And he was able then to speak to audiences who had heard about him because of the Reader's Digest. And that led to an increased sale of his book, which had been published by the University of Chicago Press, which became one of the best-selling books the press had ever had. So there was a case where the media were in the right place at the right time. The Reader's Digest was widely read and widely respected, and it got down to where little people were. It really was kind of the heartbeat of America. For many years, the Reader's Digest was the kind of classic summary of what Americans are reading and enjoying. And here is Hayek, published, of all things, in the Reader's Digest. So this begins to launch his career. This is the real push in the direction of a free market defense of individual liberty in opposition to the expansion of government power, yet it was not written by an American, and it was not originally published in America, so it wasn't perceived as an anti-Roosevelt diatribe, because it wasn't. It wasn't even a diatribe. It was simply an open discussion of the implications of the centralization of power and the concentration of money and power in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. Then an important step was taken in Washington by the Republicans in opposition to the Truman administration, and yet it didn't directly affect Truman. And the issue was, why did we go to war? Well, of course, the answer was we went to war because the Japanese attacked us. But the Republicans were raising a new issue, and that issue was, did Franklin Roosevelt know that the war was coming? Was he, in fact, tipped off early to the Japanese attack? And did he, in fact, through his administration, put pressure on the Japanese to attack in order to get America into the war, the European war, which otherwise the Americans were unwilling to do? There had been prior hearings about preparations for the war, and the commanders, the military commanders at Pearl Harbor, got the bulk of the blame. Admiral Kimmel and General Short. But there was still considerable opposition to those earlier hearings. And so the hearings began, late 45, voluminous hearings on the old question, what did he know and when did he know it? They stretched into 1946. And it became apparent to people who were hostile to Roosevelt that Roosevelt must have known a lot more than he admitted having known at the time that the war broke out. And this became a hot issue. And in fact, of any political issue associated with the New Deal in the immediate post-war era, this was the issue. And the books from small publishers against Roosevelt began to be published. This was a touchstone issue among those people who were anti-Roosevelt people who believed that this was an issue which went to the heart of the matter and which could gain favor for an anti-Roosevelt perspective with the general public. There had been such opposition to World War I retroactively in the years after World War I. There had been real revulsion against the war and against Europe's ever starting the war, but then also against the United States' entry into the war under Wilson. And so conservatives looked at this and thought maybe this could be another point of contact with the general public to make certain that the public knew that what took place in Washington really wasn't that random, that it just wasn't one of those things. And so as a result, it was clear at that point to the Republican conservative opposition that this would be a major issue and could be for the 1946 election. It was an off-year election. There was a chance that the Republicans could retake Congress. So in 46, which was going to be, the Republicans hoped, a big year for them, there were several events that took place, some of them off everybody's radar, other things became widely known. I would say 4 of them that I think were crucial. One was the publication of Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. Now, Hazlitt had been a New York Times journalist. He was a columnist, widely respected, fine writer, self-taught man, gifted economist. Hazlitt took off part of the year, was given the right to leave to write Economics in One Lesson. And when it appeared, it was obvious that this is one of the best books defending the free market, short books, written in 150 years. This was at last a book by a defender of market economics that the average person could read. And so it became a popular book. And it is still in print. People still read it to begin their self-education in the field of economics. So it's a powerful book. Not many books last over a half a century. Hazlitt's book did. Then a man who had been in California for many years with the Chamber of Commerce, a man named Leonard Read, came to New York, was briefly employed by an organization that produced economic statistics, made a lot of money as a salary, but he didn't want to spend the rest of his life publishing statistics. He was a free market man, a real free market man. He really didn't believe the government should do anything except protect people from violence, prosecute against fraud, and defend the country from invasion. And that was it. He regarded the U.S. Constitution as kind of a lefty document. And Read had a vision for teaching what he called the freedom philosophy to the average person. And he was a good publicist. He'd been with the Chamber of Commerce in California for many years. He was a good writer, and he decided it was time to take a stand. And he knew about the Volcker organization, and he knew Luno, who controlled the money. And he went to Luno, and he had a proposition. If Luno would put up some of the money, he would buy an old mansion outside of New York City, in a little town called Irvington. And when he bought that, he would then start an organization for publicizing free market ideas. And he wanted a loan, and Luno gave him the loan. And that started what is known as FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. He also had contacts with big businessmen and was able to raise enough money to get the organization off the ground and was able to repay the loan in short order. And FEE became the main organization for people who were interested in free market economics at a very entry-level basis. FEE became just about the only organization you could go to. And he would publish pamphlets from time to time. He developed a mailing list for the pamphlets, but it was very low-key, underfunded, nothing really systematic about it. The Pearl Harbor hearings ended in '46, and they were published. And as a result of this, a book was published by an author named George Morgenstern called Pearl Harbor. And it was published by a tiny publishing house just barely getting started called Devin Adair. Morgenstern was a journalist with the Chicago Tribune. Now, the Tribune had been in opposition to Roosevelt the entire time. The Tribune was the organization, if you had a media outlet, that was constantly anti-New Deal. Now, it only had influence directly around Chicago, or unless somebody subscribed to it from a distance. But it was an anti-Roosevelt outlet, and Morgenstern was on the payroll. And Morgenstern argued in this book that Roosevelt did know that the attack was coming and that he had lured the Japanese into that attack. Well, this became a real lightning rod for everybody. The left hated it. Most Republicans were afraid of it. The Democrats hated it. The idea that somebody would suggest that Roosevelt knew that the war was coming was simply outrageous. But the fact of the matter was, they knew that the code, the Japanese naval code, had been broken. They knew that in 1944. Dewey knew that. And I was told that specifically by the man who was a high-level Republican, who in fact was Republican counsel for the Pearl Harbor hearings. His name was Percy Graves. And Percy said there was no doubt he knew personally, and he knew that Dewey knew, that the Japanese code had been broken and that there was evidence that there would be an attack when there was an attack, though Percy said it was not clear where it was going to be, but it would be somewhere in the Pacific. But, Percy said, there was no way that Dewey could bring that issue up. Because if he brought the issue up during the campaign, the Japanese would know that the code had been broken. And that would have lost him the election, and it probably would have led to his arrest for treason, or at least providing important information to the enemy. So Dewey was not going to bring that up. Now, of course, it could be brought up that we had cracked the code. And this then became the issue. If there was one issue that mobilized conservatives, it was that one. Now, the other issue was, can we get back Congress? And in the fall of '46, the Republicans retook Congress. They'd been out of power since 1933. But now they retook Congress. And the leading figure of the Republican Party, and at least in Congress, was Senator Robert A. Taft, called Mr. Republican. And he was about as close to a free market guy as you could find. He didn't approve of the expansion of American power overseas. He wanted to reduce the expansion of that power. He wanted to cut taxes. He wanted income taxes cut. He was a limited government man. And he became the spokesman in the Senate for that particular view of civil government, and he was a very popular Republican senator. He had a national audience. There was one other figure during those days in the House who held the same view, in fact, even maybe farther to the right. and his name was Howard Buffett. He was from Nebraska. He's not so famous anymore, but his son Warren is rather famous in terms of the ability to amass enormous quantities of capital, but his son does not share any of his father's views, unfortunately. And Warren Buffett could be called, honestly, the Ron Paul of his era. Extreme, limited government defender, but not well known, not a nationally known figure. The Republicans did win the 80th Congress, and from that point on, Truman always referred to it as the Idiot Congress. And so there was going to be difficult times for Truman to get any legislation through Congress at that point. And so it hamstrung the Democrats during that period from 46 until the 48 election when Truman was reelected, or actually elected really the first time. He was able to, of course, he had replaced Roosevelt when Roosevelt died. But Truman won in 48 in that famous campaign, and at that point he had a great deal more power. But during this interim period he didn't. And so it looked as though there would be at least some reversal of the New Deal, but as it turned out, there was none. There was no systematic attempt to reverse the policies of the New Deal. It was only, let's not have any more policies like that. It was, we'll stand our ground here, but we're not going to attempt to roll back what has already taken place. That would not have been politically popular. So the government pulled price controls in late 46, went off the wartime standard. The government began to pull back the income tax rates in terms of the collection of taxes, went back down, been much higher during the war, been in the around, in the 20-22% range, maybe depending on what bracket you were in, dropped back down after the war. You had the beginning of an economic boom after the war. The men came home, the development of mass production. You began to have the development of what we now see as common but did not exist before, the tract homes, mass-produced tract homes, very inexpensive homes that the GIs could buy. So there was economic prosperity at home. Things seemed to be going pretty well. Well, if things are going well, it's rather tough to mobilize the troops to change anything. And the economy was doing pretty well. So the conservative movement did at least have a book out that opposed Roosevelt with respect to the war, did have a little bit of funding for a fee, which had a newsletter and had some pamphlets, did participate to some extent in the victory in 1946 in the congressional elections, but on the whole did not yet exist. There was no organized political opposition that you could see against the Truman administration, except on a piecemeal basis. Well, we don't like that, we don't like that, unions are getting too much power, and so forth. But there was no attempt in any ideological sense to say that we made fundamental mistakes in the 1930s, let alone fundamental mistakes in 1913. There was no attempt to roll back what had already come into power. So again, no real conservative movement yet. In 1947, William Volcker died. Mr. Anonymous died. He always loved anonymity, didn't want any credit for anything. Was an unknown figure, remains an unknown figure, and yet his money, through his nephew, had begun to change the American political landscape. In that same year, a book came out. Title is famous, almost nobody's read it, Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. A strange figure, taught at the University of Chicago in the English department. It was an odd book, a defense of philosophical Platonism. You wouldn't say that's going to be a bestseller. But the Ideas Have Consequences title began to spread, and he generally was a conservative, and he generally was in favor of the Southern tradition of states' rights. He was opposed to the New Deal, and so as a conservative document, not libertarian, but as a conservative document, that was one of the first post-war publications to get any kind of publicity. It was not much to start with. It was not much to hang your hat on. You had a situation in 1947 where there were just the grimmest signs that the government was going to consolidate power, not roll it back. Maybe a few glimmers of hope, but essentially the government was entrenched with whatever it had been in the post-war era. The best you could hope for did take place in late 46. They got rid of the price and wage controls. But they didn't get rid of rent controls in New York City, and the rent controls are still on in New York City. They did not stop the program of taxation with the employers sending money in advance. Withholding did not get rolled back, even though it was a wartime measure. So the government was going to stay large. It was not going to shrink back down in terms of spending. And it never really did. It's still pretty much at the same level that it was in 1946. About something in the range of about a 20% tax level by most Americans in their federal income tax. Pretty much the same. Spending goes up because of debt, but the amount of money that the feds can extract out of the general public, Joe Lunchbucket, is around 20% of his income, and that doesn't change. In 1948, though, there was a change. And in 1948, if you're going to date the origin of the conservative movement in America, I think this is the year you begin with. There were these little shoots, green shoots. I hate to use that word, that phrase now because of Bernanke talking about the economy. But there were green shoots, signs of some intellectual opposition to the New Deal and to Truman in 46 and 47, but there was not much. But in 48, a man appeared out of nowhere who had worked and was working with Time magazine. And his name was Whittaker Chambers. Strange little man, rumpled, I think is the best way to describe him. A rumpled little man who came forth with an astounding story. He said that one of the highest officials in the government, both under Roosevelt and Truman, and then one of the highest representatives of the American liberal establishment, a man named Alger Hiss, had in fact been a communist with him in a communist cell in the government as early as 1933. And he said that he, meaning Hiss, had worked to promote communism as much as he could, initially in the Department of Agriculture and then in the Department of State. Now this was a sensation because Alger Hiss had been made the head of the Carnegie Foundation. This is one of the most important intellectual organizations in the country. Left wing, no question about it, internationalist, establishment organization. And the man who had put him in charge was a man who was widely known as a liberal theologian, liberal politician, and one of the richest lawyers in the country, a man named John Foster Dulles. And Dulles had handpicked Hiss to replace him when he left the Carnegie organization. This was an untouchable man. This was a man beyond reproach. This was a man by, for, and of the American establishment. And here is this Time magazine columnist saying that Alger Hiss had been a communist. Well, it just became an explosive issue, and Congress got into it. Congress set up a committee to investigate the accusation because this was the most startling accusation that had been made against any liberal figure in the government or formerly in the government in the entire period from the New Deal until 1948. So they put Hiss under oath, and they put Chambers under oath, and they said, gentlemen, tell your story. Chambers upped the ante. Then he said, all right, I'll tell you what really happened. Hiss was a spy, and I was his liaison man for the Soviet Union. I was the agent. He was working with me to supply me with stolen documents. Well, this really upped the ante. That here was one of America's leading liberal figures who was in fact a spy if Chambers was telling the truth. And so it really escalated at that point, and it went back and forth. It became a national issue. This was followed. Everybody was watching this one. This was mainstream news. You couldn't cover this one up. And so the testimony and the cross-examination went on. Who could prove what? And what was now forming an incipient right wing, an incipient anti-communist movement, an incipient anti-left, anti-establishment movement was now beginning to form. And they formed around Chambers, and the left, to a man, put a defensive cordon around Hiss. And it was into the public media now. This was the issue. This was really like a medieval joust between two countries, with each man representing his own kingdom. And it was seen this way. It was perceived this way. You have to have representation. You have to have a representative good guy and a representative bad guy, and both sides had their guy. And for a time it looked as though Chambers was going to be unable to prove his case. And one man on the committee, a new congressman on the committee, not a famous man, serving his first term in Congress, concluded that Chambers was telling the truth. And that congressman was Richard Nixon. And Nixon became a backer of Chambers and began to get, for the first time, national recognition. And finally, Chambers said he had forgotten something. And what he had forgotten is that he had been given a series of documents which he had photographed. And he had hidden those documents in what he said was a pumpkin. He'd hidden those documents in a pumpkin for years. And he was able to retrieve the documents, and the documents in some cases matched the typewriter that Hiss had. And Hiss was proven to have lied, and he was prosecuted, and he was convicted of perjury. Now, he could not be convicted of spying because the statute of limitations had run out, but he could be convicted of perjury, and he was. And the left never forgave Chambers, and the left almost never recovered. That issue was still being fought in the press into the 1990s as to whether or not Hiss was a spy. And at that point, you began to see the rise of the anti-communist movement in the United States. Not just anti-communism in terms of we're opposed to the Russians, although that was taking place too, because the Cold War was beginning. And you had, in '48, you had the Berlin airlift, where the Russian forces had locked transportation out of Berlin. Wouldn't let any Western food in, any trucks in, and so the United States flew the planes in day after day, all night long, flew the small C-47s in to supply Berlin. So there was anti-communism at this point, no question about that, but now it was domestic anti-communism. And then finally in '48 there was a book published by a famous historian, Charles Beard, called President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War. And in this, the most prestigious American historian said that Morgenstern was right, that Roosevelt had known it was coming and had maneuvered America into a position where it would be attacked. And of course he lost his reputation, but at least now you had a real fight over the issue of the war. On to the next phase of the battle, 1949, in the next segment.